Hello and welcome to the next of our full course lectures. This lecture is the second of our lectures on risk management. So in the last lecture we talked about risk and what it was, we talked about enterprise risk management, and we talked about categorizing the various risks in the organisation. This time we're going to talk a little bit about our risk management strategy, then our risk assessment, how we go about controlling those risks, and then a little bit about reporting the risks that we found. So let's start off with our risk management strategy within the organisation. So there are a few terms that we need to be aware of for this. First of all, the risk appetite in the organisation. So this is thinking about how much risk the organisation is going to take. So what is the appetite for risk in the organisation? And that will depend on two aspects. Number one, the attitude to risk in the organisation. Now this will depend on various different aspects. For example, pressure to make sales. So if the organisation is under pressure, there's high pressure to make sales, well then that means they may take too much risk. Their attitude to risk may be that they are a risk-taking organisation. So if there's pressure to make sales, that's going to increase their attitude towards risk. The nature of the business, well again, if it's a fast moving sector that they're involved in, if it's a fast moving industry, well then that means they may have to take more risks than other organisations who may be in a more stable sector. So the nature of the business again will depend upon their attitude to risk. The background of the board. So remember, often things like the control environment, the attitude to risk is set at the top of the organisation. We mentioned this in enterprise risk management. We said that risk needs to be embedded in the organisation and the tone is set at the top. So the background of the board will determine what the attitude to risk of the organisation is. As I've already mentioned, the nature of the business and the pace of the industry will determine the attitude to risk. Fast moving industry means that the organisation probably has to take more risk. And if you think back to the last lecture where we said that you must take some risks in order to make rewards, well, if the organisation is in a fast moving, fast paced industry, well then they're going to have to take more risk to get that reward. Also reputation. If they've got a reputation to protect, well then that means they may well take less risk to protect that reputation rather than taking risk that may damage that reputation. So remember, we're talking about the risk appetite of the organisation here. It's determined by, first of all, the attitude to risk in the organisation and also the risk capacity. And that's simply how much risk the firm can bear. So remember, some firms will have a little bit of a capacity to take risk. Maybe they've got large cash reserves, they've got a large amount of risk then that they can take, whereas some organisations will be living on the edge already. So they may not simply have the capacity to take the risks that may be required. So the risk appetite of an organisation is determined by the attitude to risk and the capacity for risk within that organisation. So when we're setting a strategy for risk management, there are various elements that need to be considered. So first of all, there'll be an organisational statement on their attitude to risk. So they need to decide what their attitude to risk is. Are they a risk-taking organisation? Are they going to be at the front of the market when it comes to risk-taking? Or are they not? Are they someone who's going to follow, someone who plays it safe, an organisation that doesn't take a lot of risks? So again, they'll need to set that out in their organisation statement on their attitude to risk. They'll also think about the risk appetite that there is in the organisation, how much risk they want to take. And therefore, based on these two, they can set the objectives of their risk management strategy. They'll need to think about the risk culture in the organisation. Remember, we talked about this with enterprise risk management. How embedded is risk management within that organisation? Also, they'll need to set responsibility for risk management. We'll talk about that more when we look at the risk management committee, for example. So they'll need to set that responsibility and perhaps have that risk management committee to make sure that risks are dealt with appropriately. They'll need to have systems in place for risk management. They'll need a risk management cycle, and we'll talk about that and look at that risk assessment in a second. Lastly, they'll need performance criteria because remember, one of the key aspects of risk management is monitoring your risk management cycle, making sure that it's not just a one-off, that we're continually identifying risks, that we're continually making sure that we understand the risks in our particular area, because risks can be fast moving, risks can change, they're not just set, they don't just stay the same at all times. Depending on the market environment, risks may change almost on a daily basis. So when we're setting our risk management strategy, we need to consider all of these things. The attitude to risk, the appetite for risk, what the objectives are, is risk management embedded in our culture, who has responsibility for risk management, are there systems in place to manage risk, and have we set performance criteria for managing those risks? So let's look at how we'll go about actually assessing the risks. So a risk assessment is what we're thinking about here. Remember, this is the first part of our risk management cycle. And that involves, first of all, risk identification. So we talked last time about the various classifications of risks that we may come up against, how we can classify the risk and then think about their impact. So the first part of this is the risk identification. So we know what we're looking for, but how do we actually go about finding those risks? Well, there are various ways we can go about doing this. First of all, we could undertake a brainstorming exercise. We could get everyone in a room, all of our senior managers, and say to them, right, think about the risks that you are facing in your part of this organisation. We could then base our risk management and identify our risks based on what they come up with in that brainstorming exercise. We could also consult external advisors, specialists on risk management, who will be able to come into our organisation, have a look at the risks that we're facing and identify all of those risks for us. We could also consult with our internal audit department. Remember, they will have a good idea of the risks facing the organisation because they're continually looking at controls and compliance, whether those controls and compliance are in place and whether we're actually carrying out the procedures required within the organisation. We could undertake staff questionnaires, so rather than getting all the staff in a room and brainstorming, give them their own questionnaire and ask them to come up with risks that they feel that they face on a daily basis. Thinking about our strategic direction, we could use our PEST analysis, so our political, economic, social, technological analysis to see what risks there are in the external environment. Or we could use a SWOT analysis. That's our strengths and weaknesses within the organisation and the opportunities and threats outside of our organisation. And by looking at those, we can understand the risks that face us both within our organisation and outside the organisation. So for risk identification, we could undertake any of these: our SWOT analysis, our PEST analysis, staff questionnaires, look at internal audit, talk to external advisors, or have brainstorming sessions. Once we have identified the risks, what we'll need to do is we'll need to measure the risk. i.e., we're going to try to put a quantification on it. We're going to try and actually put a number on the risk. So we could do that using expected values. We could use volatility calculations, or indeed something called value at risk, which uses the standard deviation of the risks. So using those various aspects, we could value the risk. We could actually put a quantity on the risk so that we know if this actually occurs, what is it likely to cost us? So once we've identified the risk and we've measured what it would cost us if it actually occurred, we can undertake what's called a risk mapping exercise. So that's putting the likelihood of the risk on the left-hand side of this matrix and the impact of the risk on the bottom of the matrix. And we're moving on the left from low likelihood to high likelihood, and we're putting the impact on the bottom from low impact to high impact. We're then going to plot our response to the risk based on those two. So for example, if we have risks that are of low likelihood, so they're not very likely to happen, and they're of low impact, so that's right down in the bottom left hand corner, well, we may well simply accept those risks. they're not likely to happen, they're going to have a low impact if they do happen, well then we don't really need to worry too much about them. We just accept them, and if they happen, they happen. On the other hand, if those risks were of low impact but high likelihood, so they're not going to have a big impact if they happen, but they're highly likely to happen, that will be up in the left-hand top corner. What we'll try to do is reduce those risks, because they will have an impact. It'll be low, but they're going to happen regularly. So that means that the impact could cumulatively be quite large. So we need to reduce these by putting controls in place. So that's where our internal controls come in. We'll look at those risks, we'll try to reduce them, we'll reduce them by putting internal controls in place to do that. When it comes to high impact risks, so we're looking at the right hand side of our matrix here. So for high impact, low likelihood risks, so they're high impact but they're not likely to happen, well, we're going to transfer these. So that's the bottom right hand corner. We're going to transfer them. How do we do that? Well, we'll maybe take insurance out on those risks. That would transfer the risk to the insurance provider, and we would pay the insurance provider for that. Now, they would be willing to do that because they're not likely to happen, and they will weigh up the different insurance policies that they provide so that it doesn't matter too much to them, but we can transfer that risk away from our organisation. Lastly, thinking about risks that are high impact and high likelihood, so that's the top right hand side here, well, we want to avoid those risks altogether. So if we come up against risks that we're highly likely to encounter and they're going to have a high impact if they occur, we need to try to change our strategy to avoid those risks. So that's how we risk map. We plot it on our matrix here, with our likelihood on the left hand side, our impact along the bottom, and then we decide what to do about the risk based on where it falls in that matrix. And you may well get a scenario in the exam where you have to carry out that analysis. To remember our risk responses, are to transfer the risk, perhaps to an insurance company, to avoid the risk altogether by not undertaking whatever strategy would encounter those risks, to reduce the risks, so that would be to put internal controls in place to reduce those risks, or to accept them, i.e. they're not going to have much of an impact and they're not likely to happen, so we accept those risks. To remember these, we think TARA: transfer, avoid, reduce and accept. So remember the risk responses using that TARA. So let's look at this in a little bit of detail in a scenario. So illustration 1, read through the scenario. There's 2 parts to this illustration, so you may want to have a go at it first and then work through the answer with me. The requirement for illustration 1 is to criticise Razdutta's belief about the need for risk assessment, and then explain why risks are dynamic and therefore need to be assessed regularly. Well, we shouldn't have any problems with this. We've talked about it in the lecture, so let's apply that to this scenario. So the criticisms of her beliefs, well, she's wrong in both of her assertions. The belief that the risks do not change very much is only true in static environments. Remember, we need to look at how dynamic the environment in which the business is operating is. In reality, the changeability of risks depends upon the organisation's industry. Some will be fast moving with lots of changes, and some may be relatively static. The case mentions changes in some of YGT's risks, and that suggests that there is some dynamism in its environment, so there are some changes. So she's wrong to say that the risks don't change. Her belief that risks hardly ever materialise may be historically true, but that's unlikely. But the risk assessment highlighted at least 2 likely risks that could well materialise. And it's the nature of probability that, okay, things may not materialise for a while, but then we may get several risks that come up at the same time. That doesn't mean that we don't need to control those risks. So we still need to think about the risks even if they are not happening all the time. Risk D was assessed as highly likely, and risk B was also likely with a high potential impact. Neither of these variables would be known were it not for the intelligence gained as part of the risk assessment. Also importantly, risk B was a high risk, meaning that it's a high risk with a high impact once it materialised. Being unaware of that could have caused great damage to the organisation. So it's good that they're now aware of it, and that came about because of the risk assessment. Moving on then to why the risk assessment is dynamic. Well, it's a dynamic management activity because of changes in the organisational environment, and also because changes in the activities and the operations of the organisation which interact with the environment. So there's both changes in the environment and changes in how the business interacts with the environment. That means risk assessment must be dynamic and must be continuous. At YGT, the case describes risk C as arising from a change in the activity of the company, i.e. a new product launch. So that would indicate that things are changing, that a risk assessment is going to be needed for those changes. The new product has obviously introduced a new risk that wasn't present prior to the new product, and it may be a potential liability from the use of the product or a loss from the materials used in its production. Whatever it happens to be, it's something that's come up that wasn't there previously and we now need to deal with. Changes in the environment might include changes in any of the pest, political, economic, social, technological. Remember, we said in our risk assessment that we could use a pest analysis to try to identify the changes. And any industry changes, such as a change in the competitive behaviour of suppliers, buyers or competitors as well. Don't forget that new risks can be introduced, existing ones can become more likely or have higher impact, or the opposite. And the case describes risk D as arising from a change in legislation, which is a change in the external environment. So it might be a change in that external environment, or it may well be a change in how the business operates within it. However it comes about, things do change, and the risk assessment needs to deal with those changes. The second requirement asks us to use the TARA framework and select and explain the appropriate strategy for managing each risk of A, B, C and D, and we need to justify our selection in each case. So we know what the TARA framework is now, we've looked at it in the lecture, so let's look at these risks. So in our risk assessment, we're going to accept risk A. So why are we going to accept it? Well, we're told that the likelihood is low and the impact is low. And that's such that even if the risk materialised, it would not have a high severity. The case says that the activity giving rise to A is capable of making good returns, so that both the likelihood and severity are low, and there's no obvious reason to pursue any of the other strategies with regard to that risk. So we're going to keep doing it because we're getting high returns from it. The impact of the risk will be low and the likelihood is low. So we just keep going and accept that it may well occur. For B, we're going to avoid it. We're going to avoid risk B because the likelihood and impact are high, and it would be irrational to accept the risk. So we can't just go ahead and accept it. We should therefore avoid the risk, and that might involve changing behaviour or discontinuing a certain activity. The case says that the activity giving rise to risk B is capable of making good returns, but importantly, it's not strategically vital. Given this, there's no reason to bear this risk unless the potential return is very large and the company has high risk appetite. So they'll need to think about their risk appetite, they'll need to think about the potential return from the activity, but if it's not there, well then they'll probably just avoid this risk by not undertaking the activity. Moving on to risk C, well, we should transfer risk C. YGT says that the activity giving rise to the risk must not be discontinued, and specifies that the risk can be transferred by saying alternative arrangements for bearing the risks are possible. So to transfer the risk, that means to share it with another party, usually in the form of insurance. So the most common way to do this is to insure against the losses or to outsource or license the activity to a third party, and that transfers the risk to that third party. Lastly, for risk D, we're going to reduce that risk. The case emphasises that the risk cannot be transferred, but that the activity that gives rise to the risk can be reduced, usually through internal control. So reduction involves reducing the risk exposure by carrying out the activity in a different way, perhaps doing less of the activity that gives rise to the risk, or adopting behaviour that, while still exposing the company to the risk, results in a lower impact if that is realised. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to try to reduce that risk. Hopefully now we can see how we can go about identifying the risks and then the response that we can take to those identified risks. I want to just talk a little bit more about controlling various risks. Remember, we talked about correlated risks in the last lecture, where we said some risks will be correlated with others. So for example, there may be technological risk that correlates with product risk. So maybe you're in an industry that's fast moving, so that's technological risk, and you've developed a product that's maybe got left behind by other products. So that would be a correlation between those two risks. How could we try to manage and control that sort of risk? Well, what we can do is we can diversify. So diversification means that we move off into uncorrelated businesses. So for example, we could undertake integration. So what we're thinking here is that we have one business, perhaps we're a corporation where we have several different areas of business. What we want to do is try to make sure that those businesses are not correlated, i.e. when one industry is doing well, we expect maybe not all industries that we have in our business mix to be doing as well. But that means that when the business that's doing well perhaps starts to fail, or that industry starts to go into decline, well then some of the other industries that we're invested in will start to come up, and we can balance the risks, i.e. we don't have all of our risks in one type of business, in one type of industry. So how could we do this? Well, we could integrate. We could integrate backwards into our raw materials perhaps. Now the problem with that is that we're still having a correlation there, because the likelihood is that if the raw material supplier is supplying our industry, well then if our industry goes into decline, the raw material supplier may well do so. So that's a bit of a problem with integration, but it does mean that we get a different business mix. We could also have forward integration into our distribution network. Now that may be different because they may distribute all sorts of different products. So it may be that that is an uncorrelated business, unlike the backward integration. We could also go into horizontal integration, which means that we're perhaps buying over complementary products, products that are used with ours, or indeed that are in competition with ours. So what we're thinking here is we're going to move into uncorrelated businesses so that we're not taking risks and keeping all of our eggs in one basket, not taking all of the risk in one type of industry. So the question here is, does it work? So does it work to actually go into other types of business to diversify our business interests? Well, some people would say we should stick to the knitting. Peters and Waterman looked at excellent businesses and they said excellent businesses need to stick to the knitting, i.e. stick to what you're good at. Why would you go off into an uncorrelated business when you've got no experience in that area? So maybe you should just stick to what your business is good at rather than doing that. Also, well, we've already mentioned this, that related businesses tend to be correlated anyway. So if you're going to try to go into one of your related businesses, well then the likelihood is that the risks will be correlated with the risks that you're already exposed to. Also, there's theory to say that investors are already diversified. So they've invested in you because of your specific business area. They diversify their investments by holding investments in different industries. They don't expect you to do that for them by diversifying your business off into those different industries. So that's how we could control some of the risks. We could also reduce some of our risks in other ways, such as having those tight internal controls. So we talked about this in our risk responses. We can reduce our risks by having tight internal controls. We can also undertake hedging. So perhaps if we're invested in derivatives, we could take out other derivatives or other products to try and hedge that risk, or indeed insurance would hedge the risks that we have. Or we could share the risk. perhaps through joint ventures, perhaps through working with others to actually go into diversification, to go into new business areas. So that's how we can go about controlling the risk and how we can try to deal with related risks. Let's think about this using a scenario. Let's look at illustration 2 and think about the different correlation between risks and how we can deal with it. So have a read at the scenario, maybe have a go at the question, and then work through the answer with me. In illustration 2, our requirement is to explain what related risks are and describe risks E and F and how they might be positively correlated. So we talked about this a little bit when we talked about how business activities can be correlated. But how can actual risks be correlated and how will they be related to each other? Well, in this example, we have related risks and they vary because of the presence of another risk. That means they don't exist independently and are likely to rise and fall along with the related one. So they will rise and fall along with the risk that is related to it. Risks are positively correlated if the two risks are positively related in that one will fall when the other one is reduced and it will rise when the other one rises. So they rise and fall together. They will be negatively correlated if one rose when the other fell. So in the case of the environmental risk and reputation risk in the scenario, they may well be positively correlated. And that will be for the following reasons. So what we're saying here is they're positively correlated. The environmental risk goes up, the reputation risk will also go up. Environmental risk involves exposure to losses arising from an organisation's consumption of resources or impacts through its emissions. When an environmental risk affects a sensitive situation, that could cause negative publicity, and that can result in reputational damage. So the more environmental risk, the more risk of environmental damage and reputation damage. These two risks can have a shared cause. They can rise together and fall because they both depend on the same activity. They are considered separate risks because the losses will be incurred by either or both of the impacts. So you might get losses through the environmental impact or through the reputational impact. So we need to consider them separately, but they are related. So activities designed to reduce the environmental risk, such as acquiring resources from less environmentally sensitive sources, or through the fitting of emission controls, will reduce the likelihood of the environmental risk being realised, and that will therefore reduce the risk of the reputational risk. So that's how risks can be correlated and how we can deal with those risks. So we should now understand our risk management in terms of our risk assessment and how we use our risk matrix and our response to those risks. We also understand a little bit about controlling risk in the organisation. We also now need to look at reporting risk. So we talked about this when we talked about the risk management strategy of the organisation. We should have a risk management committee. So the risk management committee within the organisation will be responsible for various areas of risk management. First of all, that risk awareness. We've talked about it a lot. We've said that risk management needs to be embedded in the organisation, particularly when we use enterprise risk management as a model for doing that. Well, the risk management committee will be responsible for making sure that risk awareness exists within the organisation. They'll also set the risk management policies for the organisation and the processes that will be in place. So when we're thinking about the risk management cycle, the risk management committee will set the policies for that cycle. They'll also set the processes for dealing with those risks. The risk management committee will also be responsible for reporting all of this to the board. So they'll report to the board, they'll explain the risks, they'll make sure that those risks are actually explained correctly to the board and that the board understand them. Because of course the board are responsible for internal controls. So to have those internal controls, they'll need to understand the risks. So how will they do this? Well, the first thing they'll need to do is determine the risk profile and the risk appetite of the organisation. So we looked at these at the start of this lecture. So the risk management committee will need to understand what the appetite for risk is within the organisation and what the risk profile should be. They'll then look at the current policy, they'll review it, And if they have already set out a new policy, they'll monitor that policy to make sure it's being carried out and to make sure it's sufficient for the ever-changing risks that an organisation will face. As we said, they are responsible for risk awareness, so they will need to communicate risk management throughout the organisation. That tone will be set at the top. So the Risk Management Committee needs to make sure that everyone in the organisation is aware of their responsibilities and aware of the risks facing the organisation. They may well seek specialist advice if necessary. Remember, we said when we're looking for risks, we may need to consult external advisors to see what those risks are. And they'll make sure that training is given to those who need to implement the risk management processes. So they'll make sure there's training available, and they'll make sure that the risk management is implemented throughout the organisation. So how will they do this? How does the Risk Management Committee ensure that risk management is implemented? Well, they'll work with the risk manager in the organisation. So the organisation should have both a Risk Management Committee and a risk manager who is an executive within the organisation. So he will work day to day within the organisation. He'll work with the Risk Management Committee and with the board to make sure that everything is in place. He'll lead the risk management team in the organisation to make sure that all of the risks are identified and that the risk mapping process is done. So once the risk mapping is done, well, then there'll be strategies set for the various risks. So the risk manager will implement those strategies. He'll also be charged with monitoring the strategies and improving them if necessary, and of course working with the Risk Management Committee to do that. The Risk Management Committee will have set the risk awareness programme. The risk manager will need to make sure that that is implemented. The risk manager will also ensure that there's compliance with the regulations when it comes to risk management, particularly in, for example, the insurance industry, financial services industry, and they'll work with insurers should risks happen. Of course, they'll also work with insurers for those risks that they want to transfer. So they'll transfer some of the risks to insurance companies. They'll need to work with them to assess those risks. Also, the risk manager will work with external audit. The external auditor will be interested in the risk management processes in the organisation, so the risk manager can work with them to assure them that those processes are in place. So the Risk Management Committee and the risk manager work very closely together to ensure that risk is embedded throughout the organisation. The risk manager will provide the Risk Management Committee with risk reports. They'll report on all of the various risks. They'll report on the gross risk, and that's the risk before any controls are actually put in place. So what would happen if there were no controls? And they'll report on the residual risk, i.e. what's left after the controls have been put in place. What is the likelihood and what could the impact be of those particular risks after we've put the controls in place to try to reduce them? They'll also look at the reporting system. The reporting system in the organisation should follow the risk management cycle and report on all areas of it, the risk assessment, the risk controls, what we've done about the risks and how we've looked at them and monitored them. This should be reviewed annually. Remember, it is a cycle, so it means that it should continue all throughout the year and it should be monitored over that time. And we should carry out a cost-benefit analysis to make sure that our risk management is cost beneficial, to make sure we're identifying the risks correctly, reducing the risks to a sufficient level so that we're actually making a benefit from our risk management. So that was the second of our lectures on risk management. Particularly for this lecture, make sure that you're able to use the risk matrix to identify the likelihood and impact of risks and know your risk responses so that you can apply this to a scenario, because that comes up quite regularly.